Hi, I'm Glenn Blackmon, and I'm the manager of the Energy Policy Office here at the Department of Commerce. And I'm also the lead for the rulemaking that we will be doing to implement House Bill 5116, the Clean Energy Transformation Act. I want to thank everybody for coming to today's workshop. We've got a great turnout for this, a lot of interest in it, and we're going to all work during the next few hours to get to know each other a little bit better and to try to get a better understanding about the priorities that you have as stakeholders for this bill. Many of us worked together to get 5116 enacted. There's a lot of ownership in this room and the room upstairs and on the Skype connection, a lot of ownership of this bill. There's important concerns in front of us about having it implemented faithfully and in a way that respects the policy behind the bill. So we've got a lot of work in front of us, but it's also a very exciting topic that's going to be a lot of fun to work on, we think. So we here at the Department of Commerce, our motto is to strengthen communities, and energy policy is one way that we do that through things such as the Clean Energy Transformation Act. We're very glad to have a role in implementing this bill, and we think it integrates very well with the other mission of this agency. So here's what I'm going to do over the next half hour or so. I'm going to walk through section by section Senate Bill 5116 so that we can all get a little better understanding of what the bill does, and in particular which sections have, at least from what we can see, a rulemaking element to them. And then I'm going to show you what we've identified as some of the topics for that ought to be addressed in rulemaking. These are also up on the wall here. We included them in the notice about this meeting. We don't consider it to be an exhaustive list. In fact, that's really one of the important things about this workshop, is to see what we might have missed or see where the priorities lie within that list. And then I want to talk some about the rulemaking process, how it works under formal rules or laws, but also informally, how we like to approach rulemaking here at the Department of Commerce. And then I'll give you a little bit of initial thinking that we have on the timeline for this work. So this bill starts with legislative intent. It's easy to kind of skip over this section and move to specific requirements or something like that, but I think it's worth spending a little bit of time just briefly reviewing what the legislature said was they intended when they adopted this very important bill. And so what the intent section says, just to summarize it a little bit, is that Washington will lead in a transition to a clean energy economy. In doing that, we're going to prioritize family wage jobs. We're going to make sure that all customers benefit. We're going to safeguard reliability and cost. We do this because we recognize that climate change poses an immediate, significant threat to our state and to the world. We also recognize that we can do this work while also achieving other important policy objectives, and that as we approach this work, the public interest includes equitable distribution of energy benefits, reduction of burdens for vulnerable and highly impacted communities. This is a core element of the bill as expressed in the intent section. So section 2 is a lot of definitions, 40 definitions. I'm not going to walk through all of those, but if you have any experience at all with legislation, you know that oftentimes those definitions can be crucial in implementing or interpreting a bill. So we may very well be coming back to those as we work through the rulemaking process. Section 3 is the the coal requirement to eliminate coal from the portfolio of resources that are used to serve Washington customers by the end of 2025. It also includes some depreciation provisions that apply to investor-owned utilities, and there's an administrative penalty if you continue to use coal after that. At this point, we don't see a lot of rulemaking angle on Section 3, but maybe we missed something. Section 4, on the other hand, is really important in our work in the rulemaking. It's the greenhouse gas neutral standard. It says that by 2030, utilities have to achieve a greenhouse gas neutral portfolio for Washington customers and pursue cost-effective, reliable, available conservation or energy efficiency. It allows for up to 20% of that resource portfolio to still be fossil fuels if an alternative compliance mechanism is used to offset that use of fossil fuels. And then those alternative compliance options include making a payment that's used for weatherization, using unbundled renewable energy certificates, including a new type of those called a thermal REC, using energy transformation projects, and then there's a provision about the Spokane municipal waste incinerator that can be used if it meets a greenhouse gas net reduction test. We think there are probably a number of details in this section that might need some rulemaking. I mean, one specifically is that thermal RECs need to be laid out by rule. The bill says elsewhere specifically that Commerce needs to do that. Section 5 is the 100% clean standard that takes effect in 2045. It's a standard that utilities need to incorporate into their planning and resource acquisition activities. State agencies also need to incorporate this standard in their work. However, so far we haven't seen any particular need for rules to implement Section 5. Section 6 is another important section for our work. It establishes the requirements for clean energy implementation plans. These plans have a lot of detail in them, and it's a new section of law. And in particular, there's a subsection 4 that has a rate impact limit provision in it. And again, there are specific requirements in the bill that our agency and the department and the Utilities and Transportation Commission adopt rules for the cost methodology. There are probably other issues or questions within Section 6 that one or more stakeholders may feel like we need to interpret or clarify through rules. Section 7 is a reporting requirement. The utilities have to calculate and report greenhouse gas emissions from their electricity. This, we think, will need some rules essentially to set up how you do the reports, perhaps how you do the calculations. We're not sure about whether we need that second part, but it's likely to need some rules around the reporting timelines, deadlines, things like that. Section 8 is a legislative report that's on the Department of Commerce to complete in 2024. It's an important report, one that we'll work with the utilities and planning bodies to do. However, we don't think it's a section that we need any rules to implement. Section 9 addresses penalties and enforcement. Another important section that, as far as we can tell, sort of speaks for itself and probably doesn't require anything in the way of administrative rules. Section 10 is a section that has some specific direction in it about adopting rules. It gives us the authority to adopt the rules to implement this law. It also has an important reservation of authority that consumer-owned utilities, their rate-making authority is not affected by the rules that we might adopt. We've got requirements there to establish reporting rules. We need to look at opportunities to streamline the rules between this law and the existing Energy Independence Act. And it gives us a deadline for the most part, with some exceptions, we need to complete the rulemaking work by the end of 2020. Section 11 is an important bill for many stakeholders because it lays out how the requirements of the new law and the old law, the Energy Independence Act, need to be interpreted together. Nothing in that section looked to us like it would require a rule. But again, if other people see a need, then it's something we should probably discuss. Section 12 lays out requirements for energy assistance programs. Utilities need to offer energy assistance to low-income customers. The Department of Commerce will need to collect and publish data with the utilities. However, this section is one that we are going to address in a separate stakeholder process. I think you've probably already seen a notice about that the first workshop will be on Thursday, August 1st in Seattle. Those issues we felt like could be addressed better through a separate process. And so we are not going to try to identify or prioritize issues within this section of the bill in today's workshop. Section 13 addresses carbon and electricity markets and the need to make sure that markets continue to be available to utilities to use in keeping costs down and maintaining reliability, but to do that in a way so that we still meet our clean energy requirements here in the state of Washington. This section requires that we create a work group with the Utilities and Transportation Commission and stakeholders, work on these market issues, and ultimately by the middle of 2022, adopt rules to make sure that we are able to adequately track transactions and also to prevent double counting of renewable attributes between this law and any other programs or laws where those attributes might be used. Oh, and I should say that Section 13 is one that by definition will require rulemaking, though maybe not during this period before the end of 2020. It's something that we'd like to hear more about, the timing or the priority of the Section 13 work. Section 14 amends the existing utility resource plan law. It relates quite closely to Section 6, which set up the new Clean Energy Implementation Plan. And there may be, in this section as well, some need to clarify or interpret provisions through rules. We'll try to look at that in conjunction with Section 6 as we work through this rulemaking process. It also has a provision regarding the social cost of greenhouse gas emissions. And for investor-owned utilities, the statute itself sets specific values, cost values that need to be used. But the statute says that the Department of Commerce should determine those values for consumer-owned utilities. This is a determination that we wouldn't necessarily have to do by rule, but our sense is that it's probably best to set this by rule. And in fact, it seems to us like it's something that we should try to do early in the process because it is an important input to the planning work that the utilities will be doing in 2020 and 2021, et cetera. So we have been thinking, our initial thought is that that's a determination that we should make by rule and early in the process. Okay, so this slide shows a lot of sections all at once, and the reason that they are all on one slide is because none of them, as far as we can tell, have any rulemaking implication for the Department of Commerce. There's some really important sections in here and some sections that other agencies will be doing rulemaking on. But as far as we can tell, none of these sections 15 through 27 will require rulemaking for the Department of Commerce. And then we get to the last two sections of the bill, ones that amend the existing Energy Independence Act that the larger utilities in Washington have been operating under since it was adopted by the voters in 2006. The changes that Senate Bill 5116 makes to the Energy Independence Act are to establish a standard definition for a renewable energy credit, one that matches what other states and the electric industry itself uses. And then it establishes the way that hydroelectric incremental generation can be used through, in the form of a renewable energy credit. It still has to be bundled with the electricity itself, but those changes introduce hydro into the REC system, where today the law doesn't allow for that. And then finally, most importantly, it allows incremental generation from federal hydro projects, the ones that are marketed by the Bonneville Power Administration, starting in 2020. Because this provision does take effect in 2020, and our existing rules don't say that incremental generation from federal hydro is eligible, we feel like this is another one that needs early attention in the rulemaking process. We would like, by the end of 2019, to amend our rules to incorporate the federal incremental generation into the existing rules for the Energy Independence Act. So, having gone through the bill section by section at a pretty quick pace, you might agree, we have worked through, or we have identified some areas that seem likely to require some discussion through the rulemaking process. And these are also laid out on the charts on the wall here in the room for those of you here. These are the broad areas that we've identified are changes to the rules for the Energy Independence Act, things that we need to do having to do with the renewable energy certificates, including the thermal REC provision that's been added, but also other provisions related to the use of RECs to demonstrate compliance with both the CETA and the Energy Independence Act. There are a lot of planning requirements that we discussed along the way that may have rulemaking questions or issues associated with them. We see another group of issues having to do with reporting requirements, reporting greenhouse gas emissions, demonstrating that you're complying with the CETA, and the reporting of the Clean Energy Implementation Plan. There are also the wholesale market transactions and the double counting provisions from Section 13. And then finally, the greenhouse gas emission issue that I mentioned earlier, the one that might not have to be done by rule, but probably would be good practice to establish that in a rule. So those are the issues that we offer up to you just to kind of get you started. And if you see things that, or if you don't see things on there that you think should be, we're going to try to get that information to bubble up through today's workshop, through the interactive discussions that we're going to lead you through, so that we can, as best as possible, try to come up with a good, solid list of areas of rulemaking that we need to include in our implementation of Senate Bill 5116. Now what I'd like to do is talk with you a little bit about the rulemaking process itself. I've had quite a number of people who, have told me they've never gone through a rulemaking before. They're not quite sure what it's like. And I have to say, I have gone through a rulemaking a few times before, and I do feel like I can share a little bit of background on that. And the main point I want to make as I do this is that there's really quite a big difference between the formal rulemaking process and what we will actually be able to do in a more informal way. The formal process is quite rigid and linear. You start with a pre-proposal notice that is published in the Washington State Register, which is a website that the Legislative Code Revisor's Office maintains. And that's the official notice that we've started a rulemaking. We filed that for this one at the beginning of July. It was published on July 17th. So we've now officially completed that first step. So then under the formal process, the next step is the CR 102, and that's where the agency publishes its proposed rule, the actual language in the rule, and then it has to hold a public hearing and provide an opportunity for a written comment. A public hearing is an event where people can come and offer testimony on the proposed rule, say they like it or they don't like it or they think it should be changed or whatever. And then after we've conducted that public hearing, then the agency will actually adopt the rule, which is done in CR 103. When the agency adopts the rule, it also needs to issue a concise explanatory statement. This is a document that goes through and explains for each suggestion of a change to the rule that the agency decided not to include. It needs to explain why. So that's the formal process, but for our agency and for the rulemakings that I've worked on in the past, there is really a lot of work between the CR 101 and the CR 102. And that informal process is really where the communication and the problem solving occurs. It's an iterative process, not as linear as the formal process looks like, where we identify topics, we conduct informal workshops on those, we write up draft rules, circulate those around for people to look at. We collect written comments, share those among the stakeholders who are interested, do another workshop as necessary. And we do that enough that we can figure out what the issues are and come up with, in the end, a proposed rule that maybe not everybody will agree with it, but at least it will be thoroughly vetted through that discussion process, and people can kind of know where they stand and where the other stakeholders stand on that final product. And that's what we intend to do over the next year and a half, roughly, through this rulemaking process, is to work through the issues that we identify with a lot of transparent and informal discussions, giving everybody an opportunity to put their ideas forward. We'll work through them, discuss them, and come up with rules to meet the deadlines that have been established in the statute. So, timeline-wise, this, I think you will see, doesn't really have a lot of detail on it, but in rough terms, it shows you what we envision for the schedule for this rulemaking. The first three items on this list are already accomplished. The law was signed, the CR 101 was published, and here we are today at the initial rulemaking workshop. Then you see on here a milestone which consists of informal process for early rules. By early rules, what I have in mind is that we would identify some topics that we can and should address during 2019, get those wrapped up and adopted by the end of this calendar year. And so a milestone for us would be whatever rules we identify as being in that package of early ones, we would complete the rulemaking by the end of 2019. And then 2020 would be a much bigger package of rules to be developed with more informal process. I think you could expect roughly one rulemaking workshop a month over the course of 2020, so that by the end of 2020, we can adopt the rules that are required to implement this law. And then I put on here a couple of other dates that are the exceptions to that 2020 deadline. The cumulative impact assessment needs to be incorporated into the integrated resource plan process by the end of 2021. And then by mid-2022, we and the Utilities and Transportation Commission need to adopt rules concerning electricity markets and to prevent double counting of renewable energy certificates or attributes. So that is the overview that I hope will be a useful foundation for the discussions that you're going to have today. Our idea is to engage with you in a very interactive way to try to identify rulemaking issues that you or your organization believe are really important, need to be addressed, make sure they don't get overlooked, and then also to try to establish some priorities. Which of the issues are most important that we address, that have the most time sensitivity to them, are the issues that have interdependencies. We need to figure out X before we can work on Y. That sort of connections between different issues. Those are the types of things we're going to be trying to gather your feedback on over the course of the workshop. I really look forward to seeing what we come up with in this. And now I'm going to turn it over to our facilitators again to take you through this process. Thanks a lot.